The first thing Herbert noticed wasn't the skyline, it was the stairs. Herbert Lawson stepped off the Greyhound bus onto a cracked, sun-scorched Chicago street. The air smelled of exhaust, fried food, and the faint tang of graffiti. Mid-30s, neatly dressed but unassuming, he carried only a small backpack and a briefcase. He wasn't here to impress anyone, but he knew the city would test him in ways no wealthy boardroom ever could. He paused, scanning the neighborhood. Broken streetlights, graffiti tagging every available surface, and the low hum of distant sirens gave the area an unmistakable edge. Herbert's eyes fell on a group of young men leaning against a wall, arms crossed, observing every newcomer with suspicion. He felt the weight of their gaze, but did not flinch. Experience in high-stakes negotiations had taught him that calm confidence spoke louder than words. A shopkeeper struggled to fend off a petty thief as Herbert walked past. Without hesitation, he stepped in, calmly defusing the situation. He didn't shout or threaten. He just spoke with quiet authority, and the thief backed off bewildered. Herbert handed the man a few dollars to cover the stolen goods, then walked away before anyone could ask his name. The neighborhood's first whisper of curiosity had begun. He found a small apartment complex that looked run down but safe enough. The landlord, a wary older man named Mr. Thompson, squinted at Herbert as he handed over the keys. "You new here, huh? Most people like you don't last a week," the landlord said. Herbert smiled politely. "I plan to stay," he replied, voice steady, eyes unflinching. By sunset, Herbert had explored the immediate blocks, taking mental notes of alleyways, escape routes, and potential allies. He noticed children playing amidst broken benches and trash piles, their laughter oddly resilient in the face of decay. It reminded him of something he had long forgotten, the raw spirit of people who refused to be broken. As night fell, the streets shifted. Shadows grew longer, and the distant hum of sirens became closer, more urgent. A group of local thugs, led by a man Herbert would later learn as Marcus Shade Jefferson, patrolled the corner. Their steps echoed against the pavement, a warning and a challenge. Herbert stopped, assessed their formation, and continued walking as if he belonged, ignoring the stares that followed him like a dark tide. Inside his small apartment, Herbert set down his briefcase and backpack. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here to observe, to learn, and to make a difference. He pulled out a notepad, jotting down names, locations, and first impressions. Every detail mattered. The community didn't yet know it, but they had just encountered someone who could change everything, and he had spent years learning how to do it quietly, invisibly, without drawing attention to the billions he controlled. Before sleeping, Herbert walked to the window, looking down at the neighborhood. The streets were alive, messy, unpredictable. And yet, he felt a strange calm. This was more than a challenge, it was a calling. Unknown to anyone, including the most suspicious gang members, Herbert Lawson was not just a visitor. He was the start of a revolution that would quietly reshape their world. By the time Herbert turned off the light, the city had shifted imperceptibly. The air felt charged, as if the streets themselves sensed change. Herbert had arrived, and although the neighborhood did not yet know it, their lives were about to intersect with someone extraordinary, a man who had a billionaire's mind behind an ordinary exterior. And as he drifted to sleep, the first seeds of trust, suspicion, and awe were already taking root. Everyone thought he was just another newcomer. They were about to be wrong. Herbert walked the streets of his new neighborhood the following morning, coffee in hand, the sun glinting off cracked windows and rusted fire escapes. The hum of early city life mixed with the occasional distant siren, the chatter of children, and the soft rumble of buses. He observed every detail, which stores stayed open, which windows were barred, which neighbors greeted one another with nods or wary glances. He wasn't just exploring, he was gathering intelligence. He noticed Marcus Shade Jefferson leaning against a lamppost at the corner, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street like a hawk. Around him, his crew of 3 younger men laughed and shoved each other, but there was a sharpness in Marcus's gaze, a predator assessing his territory. Herbert made sure to appear casual, letting his posture communicate confidence without aggression. This was no ordinary thug. Marcus controlled the small network of streets around him, and any misstep could have consequences. As Herbert passed a small grocery store, he noticed the owner, Mr. Patel, struggling to rearrange crates while ignoring the whispers of a group of teens nearby. A crate wobbled, threatening to topple. Herbert moved without hesitation, steadying it with a calm, practiced hand. The store owner looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thanks, you're not from around here, are you?" Herbert smiled faintly. "Just passing through," he said, carefully neutral. But the seed of curiosity was planted. Who was this man who seemed unafraid of the streets? He continued down the block, noting the details others overlooked. A broken streetlight outside the corner store, a cracked sidewalk near the park, kids playing soccer with a tattered ball. He observed how the community interacted, noting the unspoken hierarchy. Some residents ignored the thugs. Others gave wary smiles. Herbert quietly understood what many hadn't. This neighborhood had potential, but it needed guidance, someone who could navigate both the streets and the shadows. Herbert's path eventually led him to a small cafe run by Tina Wong, a young Asian-American woman with keen eyes and a ready smile. The cafe smelled of strong coffee and baked goods. Herbert ordered a cup and chose a seat near the window, eyes scanning the street. Tina, observing his quiet attention, placed the cup down with a polite nod. "You new around here?" she asked. Herbert smiled politely. "Just trying to learn the neighborhood," he replied, keeping his tone light but measured. From the cafe, Herbert noticed a small altercation across the street. A younger gang member tried to snatch a woman's purse. Instinctively, Herbert crossed the street calmly, but deliberately. He didn't shout or brandish anything. He just approached with quiet authority. "Hey, take a step back," he said firmly. The gang member hesitated, surprised by the composure and confidence in Herbert's voice. He backed off, and Herbert helped the woman adjust her bag before walking away. Word traveled fast. By mid-morning, a few neighborhood kids were peeking around corners, whispering to one another. "Who's that guy?" one asked. Marcus, observing from his usual perch, raised an eyebrow. He had seen many people try to play the tough newcomer. None had survived the first week. Yet Herbert walked with an unshakable calm, interacting with the neighborhood without ever revealing more than necessary. Curiosity and suspicion danced in equal measure. Later, Herbert wandered toward the abandoned community center, a crumbling building that had once been the heart of the neighborhood. He examined it with interest, noting the broken windows, chipped paint, and overgrown yard. A group of kids darted through a gap in the fence, laughing, pretending the building was a fortress. Herbert smiled slightly. He didn't just see decay, he saw potential. If he could rebuild, even in small ways, the community might start believing in itself again. As the afternoon turned to evening, Herbert walked home slowly, scanning the streets for subtle changes. He noticed Marcus and his crew watching him from a distance, their posture tense but intrigued. The neighborhood had already begun to take note of the quiet newcomer who seemed unafraid, who didn't seek confrontation, yet commanded attention. Little did anyone know, Herbert's calm demeanor and subtle interventions were just the beginning. Back in his apartment, Herbert sat by the window, jotting notes about what he'd seen. Names, streets, potential allies, threats, everything mattered. He knew the neighborhood didn't yet understand the depth of his experience, the skills he brought from years in high-stakes corporate law, or the billions he controlled quietly behind the scenes. He was here to help, but first he had to understand. Observation was key. Patience even more so. Before sleeping, Herbert gazed down at the neighborhood. The city seemed alive with both danger and possibility. He realized that being unseen was his greatest asset. The streets, the people, the thugs, none knew what he was capable of. None guessed his true power. For now, he would remain the quiet observer. But soon, everything would change, and no one would see it coming. Sometimes the smallest actions have the loudest echoes. Herbert woke early the next morning, sunlight slanting through his thin apartment blinds. While the neighborhood still slept, he quietly gathered a small toolkit he had brought, basic, unassuming, but enough to make subtle changes. Today, his target was the streetlight outside the corner store, the one that had flickered and failed for months. A broken streetlight might seem trivial to most, but to Herbert, it symbolized neglect, fear, and lost potential. He stepped out onto the street, careful not to attract attention. The air was fresh, tinged with the scent of morning coffee and fried dough from a nearby food stall. A stray cat darted across the cracked pavement as Herbert approached the broken streetlight. He examined the wiring and pole, nodding thoughtfully. With practiced precision, he made the repairs, replacing the bulb and tightening connections, every movement deliberate and quiet. By the time he finished, the sun was fully risen, and a warm glow illuminated the block. The street, once shadowed and intimidating, suddenly looked more inviting. Residents began to stir, stepping outside to stretch and run errands. Eyes widened as the light flickered on automatically, bathing the cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls in a soft, reassuring glow. Small, simple, yet transformative. Word traveled faster than Herbert expected. By late morning, Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime resident, approached him cautiously. "Did you fix that light?" she asked, astonished. Herbert smiled modestly. "I did a little work," he replied. She studied him closely, suspicion mixed with curiosity. "You're not like the others, are you?" Herbert only shrugged, keeping his tone neutral. Mystery was his ally. It drew people in without revealing more than necessary. Lila Rodriguez, ever observant, had also noticed. She stood at a distance, notebook in hand, scribbling observations. "Who is this guy?" she muttered to herself. Lila's instincts told her that Herbert wasn't an ordinary newcomer. There was precision in his movements, a subtle confidence that suggested experience and authority. She didn't yet know what, exactly, made him different, but she intended to find out. As Herbert continued his walk, he noticed other small issues the community overlooked: the playground swing missing a chain, a broken bench in the park, and trash piling near the recycling bins. He didn't just notice, he acted. One by one, he made repairs, cleaned debris, and adjusted broken fixtures. Residents began noticing, whispering among themselves. "Who is helping us? I've never seen him around before. Maybe he actually cares." Herbert never sought credit. His interventions were invisible, almost magical, small ripples of hope in a stagnant pond. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the cafe, murmuring about the mysterious helper. Even Marcus Jefferson paused mid-conversation with his crew, frowning. He didn't understand Herbert's intentions, but the results were undeniable. The streets felt subtly safer, and that was enough to stir unease in the local gang leader. Respect mixed with caution creates a delicate balance in the neighborhood dynamics. Old man Riley, seated on his usual bench near the corner store, observed Herbert quietly. "This one is different," Riley muttered under his breath. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with experience, had seen every type of man walk these streets. Some were loud, some were brash, and some vanished after a week. Herbert's quiet diligence marked him as someone rare, a strategist who understood people, systems, and influence without needing to boast. Tina Wong, watching from her cafe window, couldn't help but notice the growing interest. Herbert moved through the streets like a shadow of reassurance, appearing where help was needed most. She admired his calm, efficient nature, yet she sensed the layers beneath, an intelligence, an authority, and perhaps resources no one had guessed. There was something about him that demanded attention, and she made a mental note to observe him more closely. By evening, the neighborhood's energy had shifted subtly. Residents lingered outside, chatting, laughing, and helping one another more openly. The streetlight Herbert repaired bathed the block in golden light, casting long, soft shadows. A sense of safety had begun to take root, not because the gangs were gone, but because someone had quietly intervened, signaling that the neighborhood had an unexpected ally. Herbert returned to his apartment, exhausted but satisfied. He made notes of the day's actions and the subtle shifts in community morale. The small interventions had begun to ripple outward, planting seeds of trust and curiosity. Even Marcus Jefferson's glances from the shadows suggested intrigue rather than hostility. Herbert understood the psychology of influence. The neighborhood was beginning to accept him without ever knowing the full measure of his capabilities, or the fortune he carried behind his modest exterior. Before sleep, Herbert looked out the window one last time. The block hummed with quiet life, subtle energy, and possibilities. His interventions were small, almost invisible, but he knew that change often began in whispers. By the time the neighborhood realized what had happened, Herbert would already be several steps ahead, guiding them without ever revealing his true identity. And when the day came that his billionaire status was revealed, no one would be able to deny the quiet miracle that had unfolded under their very noses. They thought they ruled the streets until he stepped in. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low over the cracked rooftops, when Marcus Jefferson decided to confront Herbert. Word had spread about the mysterious newcomer, repairing streetlights, tidying the park, helping residents quietly. Marcus didn't like it. The streets were his domain, and anyone appearing out of nowhere and commanding attention without allegiance was a threat. Herbert, carrying a small grocery bag, noticed Marcus approaching from a distance. He didn't flinch or hurry. He knew this moment might come, and it would define how the neighborhood perceived him. As Marcus drew closer, his crew fanned out, circling Herbert like predators. "Hey man," Marcus called, voice sharp. "You think you can just walk in here and act like you run things?" Herbert looked at Marcus steadily. "I don't run anything," he said evenly, voice calm. "I just make sure people can live without fear." His tone carried no arrogance, just conviction. The crew exchanged confused glances. Nobody had ever spoken to Marcus like that, especially someone who looked unassuming and ordinary. Marcus stepped closer, testing boundaries. "You think you can tell us how to live in our own neighborhood? We've been doing fine without someone like you around." Herbert didn't raise his voice. He shifted slightly, hands visible, demonstrating he wasn't a threat, yet his presence was commanding. "People should be able to walk down the street without worrying about their safety," he replied. "Is that really too much to ask?" The crew murmured among themselves, unsure how to react. This wasn't a fight they could win with intimidation. Herbert had something they couldn't define, a quiet authority, a sense of strategy, and confidence rooted in experience. Marcus hesitated, the anger in his eyes giving way to curiosity. He had never met someone so composed under pressure. Herbert continued, lowering his voice slightly. "I'm not here to take your place or fight you. I'm here to help the people around us. You can be part of that, or you can watch from the sidelines. The choice is yours." The word struck a chord. Marcus had always cared about the neighborhood in his own way, but he had never been offered partnership, only conflict. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Even the children playing nearby seemed to pause, sensing the tension. Marcus's jaw tightened as he considered Herbert's proposition. It was risky, but there was logic in what the newcomer said. Respect in this neighborhood wasn't taken lightly. It was earned. And Herbert had just demonstrated a rare quality: strength without aggression, intelligence without arrogance. Finally, Marcus exhaled and leaned back, though his eyes never left Herbert. "All right," he said cautiously. "I'll watch, but one wrong move, and you'll regret it." Herbert nodded slightly, acknowledging the warning without fear. "Fair enough," he replied. No one around fully understood it yet, but a subtle balance had been established. After Marcus and his crew walked away, Herbert continued his path toward the community center, thinking about the encounter. He knew trust would take time. Marcus wasn't a villain, just a product of circumstance. And if Herbert could engage him correctly, he could turn the neighborhood's most dangerous element into an ally rather than an enemy. It would require patience, strategy, and careful observation, skills he had honed in boardrooms and courtrooms for years. Later, Herbert passed by Tina Wong's cafe. She had observed the confrontation from inside, her eyes wide with interest. "That was intense," she whispered to herself, pouring coffee. "Who is this guy?" Herbert didn't notice her observing. He was already analyzing the encounter, planning subtle ways to gain Marcus's trust without compromising the neighborhood's safety. By evening, Herbert returned to his apartment and updated his notes. Marcus's reaction confirmed what Herbert already suspected. Influence in this neighborhood was built on respect, not force. And though Marcus had threatened him, he had also been intrigued, an opening Herbert could exploit later. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had witnessed a newcomer handle a potentially volatile situation with grace, courage, and strategy. The whisper of admiration had begun. Before sleep, Herbert gazed out his window at the streets below. The encounter with Marcus had been the first real test, and he had passed. The neighborhood might still fear the thugs, and the thugs might still test him again, but one truth had become clear. Herbert Lawson was no ordinary man. And the day would come when they would all realize just how extraordinary he really was. The morning air was crisp and tinged with the scent of fried food from a nearby corner stand. Herbert stepped out of his apartment, briefcase in hand, blending effortlessly into the rhythm of the neighborhood. Today, his mission was quieter but far more critical, earning the trust of the people he had come to help. He wasn't flashy, he didn't make promises he couldn't keep, he simply acted. His first stop was Mrs. Jenkins's small apartment. She had been struggling to pay property taxes and eviction loomed, a common thread in the area. Herbert approached cautiously, offering a warm smile. "I might be able to help you understand a few options," he said. He didn't reveal his fortune. Instead, he shared knowledge, quietly teaching her how to navigate the bureaucratic hurdles. Word of his assistance spread slowly, but surely. By noon, Old Man Riley, sitting on his usual bench near the corner store, had heard whispers. He waved Herbert over. "I've seen a lot of people come through these streets," Riley said, voice gravelly but curious. "Most leave after a week. You're different. Why are you helping?" Herbert's answer was simple. Because someone should. There was no boast, no hidden agenda, just sincerity, and that alone was enough to start breaking down walls. Later, Herbert visited a small daycare run by Lila Rodriguez. Children ran around in chaotic joy, the smell of crayons and paint filling the air. Lila was skeptical but allowed him to speak. "I just want to make sure the kids here are safe," Herbert explained. "If we can fix small problems, they won't grow into big ones." Lila watched him carefully, noting the thoughtfulness in his words. For the first time, she considered that Herbert might actually care more than he let on. Across the street, Marcus Jefferson watched from a distance. He didn't understand it fully, but the neighborhood was slowly starting to trust Herbert. It wasn't just about repairs or advice. It was the way Herbert moved, the way he treated people. Respect wasn't demanded. It was earned quietly. Marcus frowned, a mixture of irritation and fascination crossing his face. As evening approached, Herbert found himself at the small community center, helping organize paperwork for families at risk of eviction or facing financial challenges. Residents were hesitant at first, but his calm demeanor and practical knowledge began to break down barriers. One by one, people started to open up, sharing their struggles, and Herbert listened without judgment, offering guidance and solutions that didn't reveal his wealth, but made a real difference. Tina Wong watched from her cafe window, noticing the growing admiration. Herbert had an almost invisible influence. He didn't flaunt, he didn't lecture, but he made people feel safe and capable. Tina admired the quiet authority, wondering what drove someone so careful, so meticulous, to invest in a community that others ignored. By nightfall, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing the day's notes. Each interaction had taught him something new, about people, about the neighborhood, and about the subtle balance between respect and fear. Even Marcus Jefferson's cautious glances suggested that trust could extend to even the most skeptical members of a street hierarchy, if approached correctly. Before sleep, Herbert looked out over the streets from his window. The blocks were quieter, the residents moving with a little more confidence, a little more hope. Trust had begun to grow, not as a spectacle, but in small, nearly invisible ways. Herbert understood that real influence wasn't loud. It was patient, quiet, and methodical. And for the first time, the neighborhood began to sense that someone extraordinary had quietly arrived in their midst. Herbert's calm morning stroll was disrupted by the faint rumble of engines down the cracked streets. He paused, sensing the subtle tension in the air. For weeks, he had moved quietly, helping residents, earning trust, but quiet intervention rarely goes unnoticed. In this neighborhood, whispers spread fast, and some of those whispers carried resentment. From across the street, he noticed 3 black SUVs idling near the corner, tinted windows obscuring faces. Inside, a few men observed the block carefully, muttering to each other. Herbert recognized the signs. These were not casual visitors. They were assessing, calculating, deciding if he posed a threat. His pulse remained steady. Threats were part of his reality now, and he had learned long ago how to anticipate them. Later that afternoon, a neighbor approached Herbert cautiously. "Someone's been checking on you, cars, people, even some kids whispering," she said nervously. Herbert nodded, thanking her without alarm. "I'll take care of it," he replied quietly. No one needed to know that he already had a plan to protect the neighborhood without escalating panic. Marcus Shade. Jefferson's expression grew more complex as he observed Herbert. The gang had noticed the newcomer's quiet influence and subtle acts of authority. Some members whispered that Herbert was hiding something: intelligence, resources, perhaps even connections beyond the streets. Marcus didn't trust him fully, but he also couldn't deny Herbert's impact. A test of patience and caution had begun. That evening, Herbert walked past the corner store and noticed graffiti that wasn't there before. Messages like "Stay out" and "Who do you think you are?" scrawled in black spray paint. The warning was clear. Someone was watching, someone was testing him. But Herbert didn't falter. Instead, he documented the evidence carefully, noting the timing, style, and location. Patterns revealed intent, and Herbert was excellent at reading patterns. By nightfall, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing the day's notes. Surveillance wasn't just about watching, it was about anticipating. Someone wanted to see how far he could be pushed, how he would react to intimidation. Herbert lit a small lamp, spreading out maps, street photographs, and notes. He planned subtle measures to protect residents while keeping his presence non-threatening. As he gazed out his window, he noticed movement on rooftops and alleyways, shadows shifting against the dim glow of streetlights. The neighborhood, which had begun to feel safer during the day, now carried undercurrents of tension at night. Herbert understood that this was part of the balance: light and shadow, influence and threat, hope and fear. Officer Karen Mills, patrolling nearby, noticed Herbert on the sidewalk earlier that evening. She approached cautiously. "I've seen him helping people quietly," she said, voice low. "But I don't know his story or who's watching him." Herbert nodded, appreciating the subtle support without revealing too much. Karen could become an ally, but only if trust developed slowly, without compromising his secrets. Even Tina Wong had noticed unusual activity around the cafe. Cars idling too long, strangers observing, hushed whispers from the street. Herbert's influence was starting to attract attention, not always welcome. Yet, his calm demeanor and measured actions suggested he was aware, prepared, and unshakable. The people he had helped might not know it, but he was already shielding them from danger they couldn't see. By the time Herbert returned to his apartment, he had already formulated subtle defenses, arranging neighborhood watch schedules, discreetly warning residents, noting patterns of potential gang movement. Every step was designed to minimize risk without causing panic. For Herbert, this was more than strategy. It was survival, and a way to protect the community he had begun to care about deeply. Before sleep, Herbert stood at the window, gazing at the streets below. The night was alive with hidden eyes and unspoken intentions. Threats were real, but so was the hope he had begun to plant. The neighborhood was changing quietly, almost imperceptibly, but the balance of power was shifting. Herbert smiled faintly, knowing that danger was just the first sign of progress. In the shadows, he could already see the potential for allies, for change, and for the moment when the neighborhood would realize just who had quietly arrived among them. Herbert started the morning with a routine walk through the neighborhood, observing residents, children, and shopkeepers with quiet attention. The recent threats from rival gangs had introduced an edge to his otherwise calm days. But today, something unexpected happened. Officer Karen Mills was waiting at the corner near the grocery store, her posture alert, but not confrontational. "Morning," she called out as Herbert approached. "I've been watching how you handle things around here. Quiet, careful, but effective." Herbert nodded politely. "Good morning, Officer Mills. I try to keep the streets safe without creating fear." Her gaze softened. "You're doing more than anyone realizes. I want to help." Karen's presence was unexpected, but welcome. She had insider knowledge of the neighborhood, gang patterns, local conflicts, and residents who might be at risk. Over the next hour, she walked with Herbert, pointing out areas of concern, potential trouble spots, and key residents who might need subtle protection. Herbert listened carefully, jotting notes, analyzing patterns, and planning small interventions that could prevent escalation. As they approached the corner store, a familiar tension emerged. Marcus, Shade, Jefferson, and his crew were loitering nearby, observing Herbert's interactions with the officer. Marcus's gaze was sharp, calculating. He didn't like law enforcement interference, but he also couldn't ignore Herbert's growing influence. For once, Marcus was uncertain. Not about intimidation, but about this newcomer's intentions. Herbert approached Marcus with calm confidence, keeping his distance but maintaining eye contact. "Good morning, Marcus," he said evenly. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Morning, didn't expect company," he replied. Herbert smiled slightly. "We're just walking the neighborhood, keeping everyone safe." Marcus's frown lingered, curiosity mixed with caution. Karen interjected, her tone firm but measured. "Marcus, I know you care about this neighborhood. Herbert's just trying to make things better, without taking over. Maybe you should see it that way." Marcus studied both of them, weighing his options. Herbert didn't push. Patience was his strategy, and today's interaction was another step in building cautious trust. Later, Herbert returned to the community center with Karen accompanying him. They walked through dusty hallways and broken classrooms, noting areas that could be repaired, minor safety hazards, and residents in need of guidance. Karen's knowledge of local residents' histories, rivalries, and vulnerabilities proved invaluable. Together, they identified families at risk, small areas of tension, and ways to intervene quietly but effectively. By mid-afternoon, Herbert and Karen had a quiet system in place. He made small interventions, repairing, organizing, and advising, while Karen monitored potential threats and provided subtle protection. The neighborhood didn't yet realize they were witnessing a quiet alliance that would strengthen their streets without overt displays of power. Tina Wong watched from the cafe window, noting the unusual pairing. Herbert, the quiet newcomer, and Officer Mills, the authoritative presence. Together they moved through the neighborhood with subtle coordination. Tina felt a growing sense of curiosity and admiration. Who was this man, and why was he so effective at inspiring change quietly, without revealing everything about himself? As evening fell, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing the day's events and updating his notes. Karen had provided insights he couldn't have obtained alone, highlighting potential threats and allies alike. Marcus's behavior suggested cautious respect. The neighborhood was becoming subtly more cohesive, and Herbert's interventions were working. Yet he knew challenges lay ahead. Influence, once noticed, attracts both allies and adversaries. Before sleep, Herbert looked out over the streets, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the quiet block. The day had proven that even in a place filled with uncertainty, alliances could form quietly, effectively, and without fanfare. Karen Mills was the first official ally, someone who could provide insight and protection, and Herbert knew that together, they could prepare the neighborhood for what was coming. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long, slanted shadows across the cracked streets of the neighborhood. Herbert walked with Officer Karen Mills along the block, observing the usual rhythm of daily life. Children playing, shopkeepers cleaning windows, residents exchanging cautious smiles. All seemed calm, but Herbert's instincts told him otherwise. He had learned early on that quiet streets often conceal brewing storms. Across the street, Herbert noticed a new group of young men hanging out near the abandoned warehouse. They weren't locals, at least not ones he had seen before. Their posture was aggressive, and their eyes scanned the neighborhood with a predatory curiosity. These were not casual visitors. They were testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Herbert's calm demeanor didn't waver. He had faced threats before, and he knew the first step was observation, not confrontation. Karen leaned in slightly. "They're not from around here," she whispered. "Looks like a rival gang trying to assert control. Be careful." Herbert nodded subtly, his mind already formulating a plan. Direct confrontation wasn't the goal. He needed to protect the residents, assert influence, and avoid unnecessary violence. Strategy, patience, and timing were everything. Herbert approached the corner store, where Mrs. Jenkins and a few other residents had gathered. "Stay calm," he said softly. "Everything will be fine. Just keep inside for now." His voice carried authority without alarm, and the residents trusted him enough to follow his instructions quietly. Small steps, subtle interventions, that was his approach. The rival gang began moving down the street, pushing trash cans and yelling challenges. Their goal was clear: intimidation, dominance, and testing Herbert's influence. Marcus Jefferson observed from a nearby rooftop, arms crossed, intrigued by Herbert's response. For once, Marcus wasn't planning confrontation. He was curious to see how this quiet, methodical man handled the first real threat. Herbert didn't rush. He stepped onto the sidewalk, hands visible, posture calm but confident. "You're on our block now," he said clearly, projecting authority without aggression. "Respect the people here. No one else needs to get hurt today." The words were simple, yet the tone conveyed experience, intelligence, and quiet power. The rival gang hesitated, surprised by the calm directness of a man who appeared ordinary. Karen stayed slightly behind Herbert, ready to intervene, if necessary. She could see the gang waver, uncertainty creeping into their posture. Herbert's approach wasn't to dominate with violence. It was to assert control with presence, logic, and the subtle threat of consequences. The standoff lasted only a few minutes, but in those moments, Herbert carefully observed each member of the gang. Body language, facial expressions, possible alliances within their ranks. Every detail mattered. Then, with a deliberate nod to Karen, he began retreating slowly toward the community center, signaling calm but maintaining authority. The gang, unsure how to respond, eventually dispersed, muttering and glancing back. Residents cautiously emerged from their homes, relief visible on their faces. Herbert smiled faintly, but didn't relax. Today had been a test, not just of courage, but of strategy and influence. The neighborhood now understood, silently, that Herbert was not ordinary. He could confront threats without escalating violence, protect the community, and maintain subtle authority. Marcus Jefferson descended from the rooftop, curiosity still etched on his face. "I didn't think you had it in you," he muttered quietly as Herbert passed by. Herbert offered a polite nod. "It's not about showing strength. It's about protecting what matters." Marcus studied him silently, beginning to understand that this newcomer operated by a different set of rules Marcus had never encountered. Back at the community center, Herbert and Karen reviewed the events. "They'll test us again," Karen said quietly. "But now they know you're not someone to intimidate." Herbert nodded, updating his notes and planning subtle ways to reinforce trust and protection. Every observation, every small action, contributed to a larger strategy, securing the neighborhood, protecting the residents, and quietly asserting influence. By nightfall, Herbert returned to his apartment, reflecting on the day. The first test had been passed, but he knew the streets were unpredictable. Trust, influence, and protection were fragile, and vigilance would always be necessary. Still, a quiet satisfaction filled him. The neighborhood had seen a new type of leadership, calm, intelligent, and subtle, yet undeniably powerful. Before sleep, Herbert looked out the window over the streets below. The block was alive with soft lights, shadows, and subtle movement. Danger was always near, but so was hope. Today has proven that the right approach could shift the balance without unnecessary conflict. And deep down, Herbert knew that the neighborhood's perception of him was beginning to change. Soon, whispers of curiosity, admiration, and respect would grow louder, setting the stage for even greater challenges and revelations. The morning sun bathed the cracked streets of the neighborhood in gold as Herbert stepped outside. He had learned from yesterday's test that influence was about perception as much as action. Today, he would assert subtle dominance, not through confrontation, but through consistency, intelligence, and care. Residents might not know it yet, but the block was beginning to run on his quiet rhythm. His first stop was the community playground. One swing hung dangerously loose, the slide's railing wobbled, and litter had begun to accumulate. Herbert didn't just fix the swing. He tightened bolts, reinforced the railing, and tidied the area. By the time children arrived for play, the space was safe and welcoming. Parents exchanged quiet nods of approval, noticing Herbert's attention to details others ignored. Meanwhile, Marcus Jefferson watched from a distance, arms crossed, the sun casting shadows across his face. He couldn't figure Herbert out. The man wasn't aggressive, wasn't flashy, yet he commanded the streets without force. Each small action, from fixing swings to guiding residents, was a display of strategic authority, the kind that didn't need intimidation to leave an impact. Herbert then stopped by the corner store to assist Mr. Patel, the shop owner. A minor issue with the delivery schedule had been causing confusion and delays. Herbert calmly reorganized the paperwork, coordinated with the delivery driver, and even suggested a simple system to prevent future mistakes. Mr. Patel was astonished by the quiet efficiency, whispering to neighbors, "Who is this guy?" By late afternoon, Herbert and Officer Karen Mills walked the streets together. They checked alleyways, verified streetlights, and subtly guided residents away from risky areas. Karen couldn't help but admire Herbert's approach. He didn't need to flaunt authority. He simply solved problems, anticipating needs and threats before anyone else noticed. At the same time, Lila Rodriguez, notebook in hand, documented Herbert's movements. She noted how each action, small, deliberate, and careful, generated trust and respect among residents. There was a rhythm, a methodology, a strategic approach that made Herbert different from anyone else she had seen in the neighborhood. As evening approached, a minor dispute erupted between two residents over a parking space. Herbert intervened before it escalated. He listened carefully, proposed a fair rotation system, and mediated a solution that left both parties satisfied. The neighborhood was beginning to see Herbert as someone who could resolve conflict quietly, fairly, and efficiently, without violence or coercion. Even Marcus Jefferson's crew began noticing Herbert's influence. One of his younger members muttered, "He doesn't fight, but the block listens." Marcus remained silent, analyzing. This subtle dominance, combined with consistent action, created a new dynamic. The neighborhood was beginning to align itself around Herbert's presence, without anyone fully realizing why. Later, Herbert stopped by Tina Wong's cafe. He complimented her staff for their dedication and suggested small safety improvements outside the cafe. Tina was impressed. Not only did Herbert act quietly, but he also involved residents and local businesses, creating a sense of collective responsibility and subtle respect for his presence. By nightfall, Herbert returned to his apartment. The streets below had shifted subtly, cleaner, safer, and more cooperative. Small problems were fixed before they escalated, minor disputes were resolved, and even rival gang members hesitated before acting recklessly. Quietly, without anyone realizing the full extent, Herbert had established a presence, a subtle dominance based on trust, intelligence, and action. Before sleep, Herbert reviewed his notes. Each action, each observation, and each intervention reinforced his strategy. Subtle dominance wasn't about fear, it was about presence, consistency, and influence. Marcus Jefferson's curiosity had grown. Residents were beginning to rely on him, and allies like Officer Mills and Lila were paying attention. Slowly, Herbert was shaping the neighborhood into a safer, more organized community. The neighborhood had grown quieter in recent weeks, thanks to Herbert's careful interventions. Residents walked with more confidence, children played freely, and small conflicts were resolved before escalating. Yet, even as the streets seemed to breathe easier, Herbert knew that peace in this part of Chicago was fragile. It was only a matter of time before cracks began to appear. By late afternoon, subtle signs of trouble emerged. Graffiti marked with unfamiliar symbols appeared on walls near the abandoned warehouse. Trash cans were overturned, and one streetlight flickered as if tampered with. Herbert paused, taking in each detail. This wasn't random. It was calculated, testing his influence and the boundaries of his growing authority. Marcus Jefferson noticed, too. From his usual rooftop perch, he watched Herbert methodically assess the situation. Marcus muttered to himself, "Someone wants to challenge him, but how far will he go?" He wasn't sure if he admired Herbert or feared him. Probably a little of both. Herbert moved quietly through the block, alert but unflustered. He spoke to a few residents, reassuring them without over-explaining. Small gestures, fixing a leaning fence, clearing debris, coordinating streetlight repairs, signaled that the neighborhood remained under subtle protection. Even in the face of deliberate provocations, Herbert's calm approach maintained order. However, by evening, the threats grew more overt. A group of young men loitered near the park, shouting challenges and throwing empty bottles. Their eyes followed Herbert as he calmly moved toward them. Karen Mills, nearby, readied herself to intervene if necessary. Herbert didn't flinch. Instead, he assessed each individual, body language, reactions, and potential allies or weaknesses. "Enough," Herbert said firmly, but without aggression. "This neighborhood doesn't need your chaos. Walk away before anyone gets hurt." His tone carried authority rooted in strategy, not violence. The young men hesitated, taken aback by the calm confidence of a man who seemed ordinary but commanded attention without raising his voice. Karen Mills stepped slightly forward, providing silent backup. Her presence reinforced Herbert's authority without overshadowing it. Slowly, the young men dispersed, grumbling under their breath. Residents, who had been watching from windows and doorways, exchanged quiet murmurs of admiration and relief. Herbert's influence had once again prevented escalation. Later that night, Herbert reviewed the day's events from his apartment. He noted patterns, who was challenging his authority, where incidents occurred, and what methods were used to provoke unrest. These cracks in the peace were deliberate tests, and Herbert needed to anticipate the next moves. His quiet interventions were working, but vigilance was now more critical than ever. Meanwhile, Marcus Jefferson visited his crew at a nearby abandoned lot. "He's not just lucky," Marcus said. "That guy plans everything, even the smallest moves. We can't underestimate him." The realization sank in. Herbert's quiet dominance was more than just small acts. It was strategy, intelligence, and subtle control, all hidden behind an unassuming facade. Even Tina Wong noticed unusual activity around her cafe. Patrons whispered about the new guy and his subtle control over the neighborhood. Herbert's quiet presence was creating a ripple effect: respect, curiosity, and sometimes fear, without him ever needing to reveal his true power or wealth. Before sleep, Herbert stepped to his window and looked out over the neighborhood. The cracks in peace were signs of life, resistance, and challenge, all part of the dynamic he had to navigate. Danger was real, but so was opportunity. Each test strengthened his strategy, sharpened his observation, and prepared him for the eventual revelation of who he truly was. The morning air in Chicago had a crisp edge as Herbert stepped onto the street, briefcase in hand. For weeks, he had maintained his quiet presence, subtly influencing the neighborhood and earning trust. But today, he planned something different: a controlled reveal, small and calculated, to gauge reactions and strengthen alliances without exposing everything. His first stop was the corner store. Herbert had noticed Mr. Patel struggling with overdue invoices and a complicated tax issue. With careful subtlety, Herbert pulled out a neatly organized folder filled with simplified explanations and a small check to cover immediate expenses. Mr. Patel's eyes widened. How did you?" Herbert smiled calmly. "Just some advice and help. Keep it between us." It was the smallest hint of resources beyond what anyone expected. Word spread quietly. Residents noticed that Herbert wasn't just helpful, he had means. A new layer of intrigue began to form. Who was this man who could fix problems so effortlessly? Marcus Jefferson, observing from his rooftop, frowned. He had felt Herbert's influence for weeks, but now a shadow of suspicion crept in. Could this quiet strategist have more power than anyone realized? Later, Herbert stopped by Tina Wong's cafe. A minor plumbing issue had left her backroom flooded. With calm efficiency, Herbert arranged a repair crew and covered the costs discreetly. Tina couldn't help but be impressed. How do you manage all this?" she asked. Herbert smiled, carefully vague. "Just knowing the right people and making sure things get done," he said, leaving her curious and slightly awed. By afternoon, Herbert's influence was subtly expanding. He arranged a small donation of school supplies to children at the community center. He did so quietly, leaving the supplies with Lila Rodriguez and Karen Mills to distribute. Residents were grateful, yet Herbert never made a spectacle of it. This was intentional. He wanted people to see that he had resources, but he didn't want them to know his full identity. Marcus noticed the donations and whispered to his crew. "He's got more than we thought, but he's still playing it smart. No show, no flash, just influence." Marcus's curiosity was growing into cautious respect. He didn't understand Herbert's full story yet, but he was beginning to see that the man was no ordinary newcomer. By evening, Herbert returned to the apartment, reviewing notes. Small acts of resource deployment, covering bills, donations, repairs, were creating ripples of admiration and curiosity throughout the neighborhood. He was still invisible in terms of wealth, yet residents were beginning to sense he had far more influence than he let on. Later that night, a subtle challenge arrived. A rival gang left a marked envelope on the community center steps, a warning, anonymous but unmistakable. Herbert opened it, noting symbols and handwriting patterns. The message was clear. "We see what you're doing." He wasn't alarmed. Instead, he saw it as another test. The neighborhood was watching, Marcus was observing, and the stage was set for Herbert to reveal just enough of his resources to protect his influence. Officer Karen Mills leaned in. "This could escalate," she said quietly. Herbert nodded. "Exactly why we plan carefully. Let them test us. They'll see the limits of subtle power before they ever realize who I am." Karen understood this wasn't about confrontation, but about managing perception, influence, and control. Before sleeping, Herbert gazed out the window. The streets were quiet, but the tension lingered, like a held breath. The neighborhood's perception of him had shifted subtly, respect mixed with curiosity, admiration tinged with fear, influence silently taking root. The cracks in the peace had revealed more than challenges. They had revealed potential. And Herbert was ready. The morning sun reflected off the worn windows of the neighborhood streets, but Herbert's attention was focused on a more pressing matter. A long-standing property dispute had escalated between two families near the community center. One was facing eviction due to unpaid taxes and legal confusion. The other, unaware of the intricacies, had threatened legal action of their own. This was the perfect moment to use his hidden expertise. He arrived at the community center, greeted by Lila Rodriguez and Officer Karen Mills. "The Johnsons and the Parkers are at each other's throats again," Lila whispered. Herbert nodded calmly. "Let's settle this before it escalates further." Quietly, strategically. He opened his briefcase, pulling out neatly organized folders, legal documents, and charts outlining tax details and property rights. As residents gathered curiously, Herbert began walking both families through the legal details, explaining how each step worked and what options were available. His tone was conversational but precise, turning complex tax law into understandable guidance. Slowly, frustration turned into comprehension. "So, you're saying we could resolve this without a court?" one resident asked. Herbert smiled faintly. "Exactly. And no one loses what they've worked for." As he worked, a few neighbors began whispering among themselves. Some recognized the efficiency and confidence in his guidance. Others noticed the subtle hints of financial capability in how Herbert facilitated immediate solutions. He paid bills, coordinated temporary housing, and even suggested ways to prevent future disputes, actions that quietly hinted at resources far beyond the norm for someone in the neighborhood. Marcus Jefferson watched from a distance, leaning against a brick wall. His skepticism wavered. "That's impressive," he muttered to a crew member. For weeks, He had observed Herbert's quiet influence, but this, using legal and financial expertise to resolve a serious conflict, was something entirely different. Marcus began to sense that this man was no ordinary resident, and the whispers of hidden wealth or power were no longer just rumors. By late afternoon, Herbert had effectively mediated the dispute. Both families were satisfied, and the community had quietly witnessed his skill, intelligence, and subtle financial influence. He hadn't flaunted wealth, but he had demonstrated competence and resources in a way that commanded respect. The first reveal of his hidden abilities had occurred, leaving a quiet ripple of awe throughout the neighborhood. Tina Wong, observing from her cafe window, took note of the scene. Herbert wasn't just a helper. He was a strategist, a problem solver, and now a subtle force of power. His calm authority and discreet display of resources left her intrigued and impressed. Who was this man who could quietly change lives without making a spectacle? As evening fell, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing notes on interactions, responses, and subtle hints of influence. He understood that this first reveal had changed perceptions. Neighbors were beginning to recognize a new layer of power, not a show of wealth, but competence, resourcefulness, and the ability to act decisively. Even Marcus Jefferson, previously skeptical, was beginning to reconsider his stance. Before sleep, Herbert looked out over the streets. The block was quiet, but a subtle shift had occurred. Trust had grown, curiosity had been piqued, and respect had quietly settled in. The first reveal had not only solved a serious problem, it had planted seeds of intrigue and recognition. The neighborhood was beginning to see that Herbert was different, and the whispers of who he truly was would soon grow louder. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the block, and for the first time in weeks, Herbert noticed something unusual. A subtle energy had begun to ripple through the neighborhood. Residents walked with lighter steps, conversations carried a hopeful tone, and even the streets seemed more alive. The first reveal had done more than earn respect. It had awakened a sense of possibility. Herbert's first stop was the community park. Overgrown grass, broken benches, and litter had once dominated the area. Today, Herbert coordinated with Karen Mills and a small group of residents to begin renovations. He brought in tools, coordinated volunteers, and subtly directed improvements without revealing the full scale of resources he could provide. Children began to gather as the work progressed, curiosity shining in their eyes. Herbert encouraged them to help in small, safe ways, painting benches, planting flowers, picking up trash. By the afternoon, the park had transformed. The once neglected space now glimmered with possibility, and residents quietly marveled at the speed and efficiency of the improvements. Marcus Jefferson observed from a nearby rooftop, his arms crossed. The neighborhood's transformation was undeniable. For weeks, Herbert had been a quiet presence. Now, he was a force subtly reshaping the block. Marcus muttered to his crew, "He's changing the rules, and we're just spectators." A mixture of curiosity, respect, and unease flickered across his face. Later, Herbert stopped by the corner store to check on Mr. Patel. The small improvements he had initiated earlier, organization, efficient schedules, minor repairs, had created a ripple effect. Customers were arriving more frequently, and Mr. Patel's stress seemed to ease. Herbert quietly facilitated solutions without fanfare, demonstrating that change could come subtly yet powerfully. By late afternoon, Tina Wong's cafe had received new supplies and minor renovations Herbert had coordinated discreetly. A fresh coat of paint, repaired tables, and a subtle security upgrade improved both aesthetics and safety. Tina watched Herbert calmly coordinate the work, impressed by how seamlessly he managed change without demanding attention or recognition. Even Lila Rodriguez began noticing subtle shifts. She saw neighbors talking more openly, children playing safely, and Marcus Jefferson's crew watching quietly from alleyways. Herbert's influence wasn't through intimidation or wealth flaunting, it was through thoughtful action, strategy, and consistent care. As evening approached, Karen Mills checked in. "The block looks different," she said, her tone a mix of surprise and satisfaction. Herbert smiled faintly. "Change takes time," but it's contagious. Once people see what's possible, momentum builds. And that's when influence becomes real. By nightfall, the neighborhood glimmered with subtle transformation. Streets were cleaner, parks safer, and residents were quietly organizing initiatives of their own. Even Marcus Jefferson couldn't deny the impact. Sitting on a rooftop with his crew, he whispered, "He's more than a man, he's a movement." The neighborhood had awakened, and Herbert's influence had laid the foundation for more substantial changes to come. Before sleep, Herbert stood at his apartment window, looking over the block. The day had proven that quiet, thoughtful action could inspire real change. The neighborhood was alive, alert, and beginning to rely on his guidance. The ripple effects of subtle influence were now undeniable. And deep down, Herbert knew that with careful planning, the time would soon come to reveal the full extent of his identity and resources. When influence grows, so do the threats. It's only a matter of time. The sun hung low over the neighborhood, casting long shadows that stretched across the streets Herbert had worked so hard to transform. The block had changed subtly but significantly, and residents walked with newfound confidence. Yet with visibility comes scrutiny, and with respect comes challenges. Today, Herbert would face the first serious test to measure the limits of his growing influence. By mid-afternoon, the tension became palpable. A rival gang, larger than the ones he had encountered before, moved through the neighborhood with purpose. They weren't just loitering. They were marking territory, leaving graffiti, and intimidating residents. Marcus Jefferson watched silently from his rooftop, intrigued but cautious. He knew Herbert's subtle dominance had held so far, but could it withstand something bigger? Herbert didn't rush. He calmly assessed each member of the gang, noting posture, alliances, and weaknesses. His strategy was clear: protect the residents, maintain control, and avoid unnecessary escalation. He called Officer Karen Mills over. "We handle this together," he said softly. Karen nodded, ready for intervention but trusting Herbert's strategic instincts. The gang approached the community center, shouting and demanding attention. Residents watched from windows and doorways, fear creeping back into the block. Herbert stepped forward with calm authority. "This is our neighborhood," he said clearly. "No one gets hurt if you respect the people here. Leave, and no one will have to regret anything." Karen Mills moved subtly beside him, providing backup without overshadowing his authority. Slowly, the gang hesitated, realizing that Herbert's calm and methodical presence wasn't a bluff. His first reveal, small acts of resource and legal support, and the transformation of the neighborhood had built more than admiration. It had built a reputation. One of the gang leaders, a tall man with tattoos across his arms, stepped forward. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. Herbert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward Marcus Jefferson's observing crew. "This neighborhood has its own rules. Test them, and you'll see consequences you weren't prepared for." The subtle hint of unseen alliances and resources was enough to make the gang reconsider. After a tense pause, the gang reluctantly backed away, leaving graffiti but sparing residents from harm. The block exhaled collectively. Herbert's strategic patience and controlled revelation of influence had preserved peace without a fight, proving that his subtle dominance extended beyond simple neighborhood goodwill. It had become a force that even rival gangs acknowledged. Marcus Jefferson descended from his rooftop afterward. "I didn't think he had it in him," he admitted quietly to his crew. "This guy, he's something else. Keep watching. We'll need to understand him before making any moves." Marcus's respect and caution grew. Herbert's influence was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming a factor Marcus had to reckon with. Meanwhile, Tina Wong noted the tension in her cafe. Patrons whispered about Herbert, their admiration mingled with intrigue. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, yet he commanded the block in ways that were subtle, effective, and impossible to ignore. Each challenge he faced strengthened the perception of him as more than just a newcomer. By nightfall, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing the day's events. The challenges were escalating, yet his careful strategy, network of allies, and subtle displays of competence had preserved peace. Every threat, Every test was an opportunity to solidify influence, understand rivals, and demonstrate that his authority wasn't limited to small acts. It could extend to controlling conflict without violence. Before sleep, Herbert looked out over the streets. The block had faced its first major test of influence, and it had passed. Residents were safer, Marcus Jefferson was cautious, and the neighborhood's perception of Herbert as someone extraordinary was growing. But Herbert knew that larger challenges awaited, threats that would test both his strategy and the carefully guarded secret of his true identity. The morning air was crisp over the neighborhood, carrying faint scents of coffee and fresh bread from Tina Wong's cafe. Herbert stepped outside, his mind already running through the day's plans. The challenge from yesterday had proven one thing: influence alone wasn't enough. To protect the neighborhood, he needed a network, a web of allies who could act, report, and safeguard the community. First stop was the community center. Herbert gathered a small group of residents he trusted, including Lila Rodriguez, Officer Karen Mills, and a few local business owners. He didn't reveal wealth or power, but he shared knowledge, safety tips, legal guidance, and strategies for conflict resolution. Each instruction was a seed, planting trust and collaboration among the group. He emphasized discretion. "We operate quietly," he said. "Observe patterns, report unusual behavior, and support each other. The neighborhood is stronger when we act together." Lila took notes meticulously, Karen nodded approvingly, and the business owners exchanged glances, slowly realizing Herbert's guidance carried authority they had never seen before. Later, Herbert visited Tina Wong's cafe to discuss community outreach. "We can create small initiatives," he suggested. "Neighborhood watches, educational programs, and safety patrols." Tina agreed enthusiastically. Herbert arranged for subtle funding, tools, and organizational help, just enough to make an impact without revealing his full capacity. The cafe became a hub for quiet coordination. Across the block, Marcus Jefferson watched from his rooftop. The neighborhood's transformation was undeniable, and Herbert's influence was now multiplying through a network of engaged residents. Marcus muttered, "He's not just a man, he's organizing the whole block. That's dangerous for anyone who thought they controlled it." His crew shifted uneasily, realizing the subtle power Herbert wielded didn't rely on force, it relied on strategy and human connections. Herbert's next move was to strengthen ties with key families who had been hesitant before. He visited the Johnsons, the Parkers, and a few other households quietly, offering advice, resources, and small gestures of help. Each interaction was carefully measured to build trust, not dependency. Slowly, Herbert was creating a web of support that could operate independently while still aligning with his guidance. By late afternoon, the first signs of tangible results emerged. A minor street dispute was resolved before escalating, thanks to coordinated neighborhood observation. A broken streetlight was reported and repaired quickly. Residents began subtly monitoring each other's safety, reporting unusual behavior to Herbert's network without even realizing they were part of a coordinated effort. Tina Wong's cafe buzzed quietly with activity as volunteers and residents discussed upcoming safety initiatives. Herbert observed, calm and focused, noting who was reliable, who needed encouragement, and where small adjustments could enhance the network. His influence was now amplified through others, spreading quietly like threads of light weaving across the neighborhood. By evening, Karen Mills checked in. "You've done something remarkable here," she said. "People are looking out for each other now." Herbert smiled faintly. "It's not about me. It's about creating a system where the neighborhood protects itself. Influence is strongest when it multiplies quietly." Karen nodded, understanding that Herbert's genius lay in empowering others without revealing the full extent of his abilities. As night fell, Herbert stood at his apartment window, observing the network in action. Lights flickered on in homes where volunteers monitored safety, streets felt safer, and the subtle influence of his guidance was evident everywhere. Even Marcus Jefferson's crew, still watching, began to respect the reach Herbert had achieved, not through intimidation, but through organized trust and strategic planning. Before sleep, Herbert reflected. The network had expanded faster than he anticipated, and his influence was now interwoven with the very fabric of the neighborhood. Quietly, subtly, he was building a community that relied on each other while respecting his guidance. The stage was now set for larger reveals, higher stakes, and the eventual unveiling of the truth about who Herbert really was. The night was unusually quiet over the neighborhood, almost eerily so. Herbert had been monitoring subtle shifts for weeks, but tonight felt different. A new threat had arrived, a group of outsiders, more organized and ruthless than the previous gangs, was moving into the block, testing boundaries and intimidating residents. The subtle influence Herbert had built was strong, but tonight, it would need tangible force to protect the network he had worked so hard to cultivate. By mid-evening, reports came in from residents. Broken fences, threats shouted from alleyways, and vandalism had begun near the community park. Herbert grabbed his leather briefcase and headed out, calling Officer Karen Mills on the way. "We need to handle this carefully but decisively," he said. Karen's voice was steady. "I'm with you." Together, they moved into the streets where the new threat had made its mark. Herbert arrived at the park to find the outsiders harassing residents. They were larger in number and clearly testing the neighborhood's limits. But Herbert remained calm, analyzing each person's stance, position, and potential weaknesses. His strategy was precise. Demonstrate power subtly but effectively, enough to protect residents without fully revealing the depth of his resources. "Stop," Herbert said, his voice steady and commanding. "This neighborhood isn't yours to take. Leave, and no one gets hurt." He revealed just a hint of his resources, a small tablet displaying live street cameras, showing the exact positions of backup volunteers and allies ready to intervene. The outsiders paused, surprised by the unseen network Herbert controlled. Karen Mills moved subtly behind him, reinforcing the sense of authority. Residents peeked from windows and alleys, realizing that Herbert wasn't alone. He had quietly organized a hidden network capable of defending the block. This combination of unseen power and visible calm was enough to make even the boldest outsiders reconsider their actions. Herbert then issued clear, methodical instructions to selected allies through a discreet communication system. Within minutes, key points of the neighborhood were being monitored and protected. Supplies and tools arranged earlier were now deployed to ensure resident safety. The outsiders, sensing the coordinated response, realized they were outmatched not by force alone, but by strategy, preparation, and unseen influence. One of the outsiders, growing frustrated, stepped forward aggressively. Herbert didn't raise his voice or escalate physically. Instead, he revealed another hint of capability, a financial leverage letter showing property ownership and legal authority over the block. The outsider froze, realizing Herbert could make moves that would threaten their position legally, socially, and strategically. By night's end, the threat had been neutralized. The outsiders withdrew, leaving the neighborhood intact. Residents, quietly observing, began to murmur in admiration. Herbert had demonstrated that hidden power, intelligence, strategic planning, legal knowledge, and subtle financial resources was enough to protect the block without resorting to open conflict. Marcus Jefferson, observing from his usual rooftop, could only shake his head. "This guy, he's untouchable," he muttered. Even he had begun to recognize that Herbert's quiet influence and hidden capabilities were far beyond anything he had anticipated. Respect, caution, and perhaps fear began to intertwine in his perception. Later, Herbert returned to his apartment, reviewing notes and monitoring the neighborhood. The night had been a test of his hidden power, and it had passed. Residents were safe, his network had responded flawlessly, and even his rivals now recognized that Herbert's influence was backed by capability. The neighborhood was no longer just under his guidance, it was protected by his hidden power. Before sleep, Herbert looked out over the quiet streets. The first true display of hidden power had shown what he could do when necessary. The neighborhood's trust was now deeper, his allies more committed, and the stage was set for the eventual revelation of his billionaire identity, a reveal that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the block, highlighting subtle improvements that Herbert had orchestrated. Residents moved about confidently, Children played safely in the park, and local shops buzzed with quiet energy. Yet Herbert knew the time was nearing for a carefully measured tease, a hint of his wealth that would stir curiosity without fully revealing the truth. His first stop was the corner store. Herbert had noticed that Mr. Patel was struggling with a shipment delay. Without fanfare, Herbert arranged expedited delivery, covering the cost discreetly through a private account. Mr. Patel noticed the unusual speed and efficiency. "I don't know how you did this," he stammered. Herbert smiled faintly. "Sometimes connections help. Keep it quiet, though." The subtle implication of wealth was enough to intrigue, not intimidate. Later, Herbert visited Tina Wong's cafe. He suggested minor upgrades, a high-end coffee machine, better seating, small renovations, all executed quietly and efficiently. Tina noticed the quality and speed but didn't question where it came from. Herbert's calm assurance made it feel natural. "Just making things better for the community," he said, smiling, leaving Tina curious and slightly awed. By afternoon, whispers had begun. Residents noticed subtle signs: Herbert's precise coordination, small financial gestures, and efficient problem-solving that suggested resources far beyond normal. Marcus Jefferson, perched on his rooftop, was the first to connect the dots. "That's not just influence, that's money," he muttered. "He's hiding something big." Herbert knew Marcus's suspicion was growing. To test reactions, he arranged a discreet donation for the community center: books, computers, and supplies that were clearly high quality and expensive. Lila Rodriguez, receiving the items, looked up at Herbert. How did you get all this?" Herbert smiled, vague but deliberate. "Let's just say I have some ways." The small hint of wealth ignited curiosity without revealing everything. Later, Herbert's subtlety extended to the streets. A car with tinted windows parked discreetly nearby during community patrols, giving the impression of unseen protection. Residents noticed, but didn't question it, yet the implication was clear. Herbert had resources, allies, and capabilities far beyond the ordinary. By evening, Tina Wong spoke to Lila. "He's not just smart, is he?" she said quietly. "There's something more, something wealthy, influential. You can feel it." Lila nodded. Herbert had accomplished exactly what he wanted. Curiosity, respect, and speculation were spreading, increasing the aura of mystery around him. Meanwhile, Marcus Jefferson convened a meeting with his crew. "He's hiding billions," Marcus whispered, disbelief mixed with awe. "And we've been underestimating him this whole time. Watch closely, he's about to change the rules." Even his rivals were beginning to respect the quiet hints of wealth and the influence it commanded. Herbert ended the day with a quiet walk through the block. Residents glanced at him with curiosity, noticing subtle changes, gestures, and capabilities that hinted at something extraordinary. By carefully controlling the reveal, he had created a buzz of speculation and all while keeping his billionaire identity completely hidden, precisely the effect he intended. Before bed, Herbert looked out his apartment window, the city lights reflecting softly on his face. He had planted curiosity, admiration, and respect, but the full reveal, the one that would leave the neighborhood stunned, was still coming. Patience was key. The billionaire hints were only the beginning of the final act. The sun rose over the Chicago streets, casting golden light on the transformed neighborhood. Residents walked with newfound confidence. Children played safely in the parks, and the corner store buzzed with life. But today was different. Today, the truth about Herbert, quiet, calm, strategic Herbert, was about to shake the block to its core. Herbert had called a community gathering at the park, the place he had transformed over months. Residents gathered, curious, unaware that the man who had subtly changed their lives was about to reveal the biggest secret of all. He stepped forward, calm and deliberate, scanning the crowd that now trusted him implicitly. "Everyone here knows me as someone who cares about this block," Herbert began, his voice steady and warm. "But there's something you don't know, something I've kept private for years." He paused, letting the suspense settle. The crowd leaned in, curiosity rippling through every face. Then, with a quiet smile, he revealed his true identity, a billionaire and experienced tax lawyer who had kept his wealth secret to focus on real, meaningful change rather than show. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Marcus Jefferson, standing in the back with his crew, froze. "No way," he muttered. The man they had underestimated for months, quiet, calm, seemingly ordinary, was extraordinary in every sense. Herbert continued, carefully explaining that his wealth had been a tool, not a statement. "I didn't reveal this before because I wanted to focus on what really matters: people, community, and real impact. Money alone doesn't create change. It empowers action when used wisely." Residents nodded, absorbing the truth and realizing the depth of Herbert's care and strategy over the past months. He then demonstrated tangible proof, documents, financial support channels, and resources that had subtly improved lives over months. The community finally understood. Every donation, every repair, every subtle act of help had been backed by serious means, carefully controlled to serve the neighborhood. Tina Wong, Lila Rodriguez, and Karen Mills watched with awe, finally connecting all the dots of his influence, strategy, and dedication. Marcus Jefferson, once skeptical, now approached cautiously. "So, all this time you've been you?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Herbert smiled, calm and strategic. "Yes. And now that you know, you can choose to respect this block, or you can continue testing it and face consequences." Marcus nodded slowly, a mixture of respect and caution in his eyes. By late afternoon, the revelation had transformed the atmosphere. The block buzzed with excitement and admiration. Residents now understood that the quiet man who had guided, protected, and transformed their neighborhood was a billionaire, a man who had used his resources wisely and discreetly, not for attention, but for real change. Herbert stepped back, watching the neighborhood he had helped shape. The whispers of curiosity were replaced with awe, trust, and hope. Change, he reflected, isn't about wealth alone. It's about using what you have to make a difference. Influence, strategy, and action, when combined, can do more than anyone imagines. If one man can quietly transform a neighborhood with strategy, patience, and care, imagine what we could all do when we act wisely together. Look around your world, your street, your community, your city. What can you change? Who can you help? The first step starts with noticing, acting, and never underestimating the quiet power of influence. Start today. Make the difference only you can make. Comment below what change you will bring to your environment.